If you're struggling to save money, of course, you're not alone. Most of the people out there at some point or another in their lives, they're going to struggle to save a certain percentage of their income. And this is to no fault of our own, at least not directly. You see, our brains are actually wired to work against us when we are trying to save money for the future. Think about it. Our brains have evolved for millions and millions of years in an environment that doesn't resemble our current environment at all. As our brains evolved, their sole focus was to help us survive now. And because there were so many things endangering our lives that right now, today, could be our last day on Earth, our brain had to adapt to all of these things to be biased towards instant gratification. And these biases, while very useful in the past, nowadays could actually be harming us. For example, when we're trying to save money. And this is actually not the only bias that we would be dealing with. In this video, I'm going to talk about 5 different biases, cognitive biases, that are preventing us from saving money. And of course, I'm also going to talk to you about some ways in which you can consciously start to overcome them. So the first bias that I want to talk about is present bias. The one that I just mentioned, where our brain is wired to prefer instant gratification now, than postpone it. Our brain cannot naturally think very far into the future. It may think about later today, later this week, maybe later this month, but that is not a long enough time frame for it to actually help us save in the long term for retirement or for buying a house 3 or 4 or 5 years from now. So you can see why we may struggle with this. Our brain will prefer that we spend money now on all of those shiny objects around us than to save money for a potential future that our brain thinks is very unlikely to happen. So how do we start to fight against this bias consciously? Because one thing that we humans do have is some consciousness that can start to override these biases that are programmed into our monkey brain. So for this particular present bias, I think implementing the Parkinson's law into our lives can be very helpful. Now, Parkinson's law is actually more focused on the productivity world because Parkinson's law states that a task will take as much time as we allocate towards it. So if we have to write an essay and we have 1 month to do so, we're going to take the entire month to write the essay. But if only we had 3 weeks, we could write that essay in those 3 weeks. Adapting this law to personal finance, we could say that we will spend all the money that is available. So how do we not spend all our money because of present bias, for example? Well, we save automatically at the beginning of the month. So as soon as we receive our check for the month, we should save whatever percentage we have in mind, and that is already out of the way, and we may be able to survive only with the remaining amount of money. Now, of course, if you save 50% right at the beginning of the month, that may be stretching it a little bit too far. At the beginning, you can start with 1%, 2%, 5% of your income, see how it works out, and if it does work out, start increasing this percentage a little by little, month after month. Definitely don't try to start with a big margin like 20, 25, 50%. Start small, make some progress month after month. The second bias that I want to talk about is anchoring bias. This anchoring bias anchors our thinking to the first number that we learn associated to something. So for example, if you find a computer that costs $1,000, this $1,000 is going to be your anchor point because it's the first value that you learned associated to this computer. So of course, if the next day you see it at $1,100, you're going to feel that that is expensive because you're anchored to $1,000. And the same goes the other way. If the next day you see it at $900, you're going to feel like it is cheap because you're anchored towards a bigger number. Of course, you may see where this is going. Our brain is going to want to take advantage of that new opportunity. FOMO comes into play a little bit in here, the fear of missing out on this opportunity, this discount, and we spend the money, thinking that we are saving $100, but if we weren't actually planning on buying this laptop and we only purchased it because it was cheaper than we thought due to our anchoring bias, we are actually spending $900 that are no longer inside of our pockets. So how do we start to fight against this programmed bias in our brains? Well, in this case, we could actually start using the 4x squared rule. This rule is one that I created for myself based on two different 2x rules. 2x times 2x, 4x squared. The first 2x rule comes from Ramit Sethi's I Will Teach You to Be Rich book that says that we should have two priorities on our lives. That we should spend extravagantly on those two priorities and cut expenses mercilessly on everything else. So this first part of the 4x squared rule would say that we only spend money on those two things that are our priorities, and everything that is, of course, necessary for us to live, like food, shelter, transport, something like that. And the second part, the second 2x rule, comes from Nick Maggiulli's Just Keep Buying book that says that we should only spend on those things that we can afford twice. So if this laptop costs $900, first we would evaluate if buying computers is part of our priority. If it is, then we should also be able to cover that expense twice. $900 to actually buy the computer, and the other $900 we would save. I have talked a little bit more about this 4x squared rule in another video that I'm going to leave for you right here in the top left corner of the screen, but you could see how this 4x squared rule could help us against this anchoring bias. Even if I am falling prey to these marketing techniques, seeing a computer on a discount, I have to pass two different very strong filters. First, that computer should be one of my priorities, and even if it is, I should be able to afford it twice. Amazing rule, I think, to start implementing into our daily lives. Now, the third bias that I want to talk about is the sunk cost bias. To understand this bias, let's think of an example. Imagine that a month ago, you purchased a ticket to go to the theater later today. But today you decide that you don't feel like going to a theater. You really don't feel like it, you just don't want to do it. But if you don't go, you're going to feel like you're losing that money that you already used to purchase the ticket. So for you to not lose this money, you decide to go. And you pay for a cab, and maybe you pay for a drink or a snack during the intermission. Maybe you even go for dinner after the show, and all of these additional costs only because of this sunk cost bias. One purchase that you didn't even want to use anymore triggered many more other purchases that actually translated into less money in your pockets at the end of the day. So how do we fight against this sunk cost bias? Well, actually knowing about the existence of this bias is a very good first step. But from now on, you should be very conscious of all of these expenses that you have already made in the past that at some point in the present or in the future are creating even more expenses, like the ticket in this example that I mentioned. And if you do find some of these purchases that at some point you feel like you should take advantage of that because you have already paid for it, even if taking advantage of it means spending even more money, that is sunk cost bias working against you. At that point, what you should do is just forget about any money that has already left your pockets, left your net worth. That money has already been spent. You cannot get it back, but you can keep the money that is currently in your pocket instead of actually spending even more money just so you don't lose that money that you already spent. The fourth cognitive bias of this list is the spotlight bias, in which we as humans think that we are the spotlight of everyone's attention. We think that everyone at some point is going to pay attention to us. We're walking in the street and everyone at some point is going to look towards us, is going to judge us, is going to admire us, is going to take a look at what we're wearing, what car we're driving, and so on. Because we are our own spotlights, we are self-centered, we're always thinking about ourselves. We have this bias thinking that everyone else at some point is also thinking about us. So naturally, this makes us want to spend money to impress all those people. We want to spend money on nice designer clothes and very cool cars and amazing new houses and vacations in beautiful places that we can then share on Instagram for everyone to admire us because we are the center of their attention according to our brains, which of course, consciously, rationally, we understand that we're definitely not, but you may be able to notice how this pushes us towards spending money, as the saying goes, that we don't have to buy things that we don't need to impress people that we don't like or even know in this scenario. So again, to fight this spotlight bias, we can turn to the 4x squared rule again. We can focus only on those things that are our priorities and think that it doesn't matter that someone thinks we're driving an ugly car because maybe cars are not part of our priorities. So we try to switch the focus from what other people may think about us, oh, he drives an ugly car, to what my priorities are. Oh, I don't want a new car. I prefer to spend my money on these priorities, which are spending time with my family and taking one nice trip every year, for example. Sometimes this is enough for us to walk away from some purchases that we were about to make because we wanted to impress someone. But again, just implementing the 4x square rule in its entirety into our lives means that not only do we filter those expenses that are our priorities, but also we have to pass another big filter, which is that we should be able to afford something twice. These two huge filters will prevent us from making a lot of unnecessary purchases. Finally, the fifth bias that I want to talk about is actually an effect that is called the Diderot effect. The Diderot effect is more noticeable when we purchase something big, like a house. So let's say that we just purchased a big house or we started renting a bigger house, a bigger apartment, a nicer apartment. Immediately we're going to notice that our furniture, it looks ugly in this new place. There are many incomplete spaces. We should buy more furniture. We should buy new furniture. And suddenly I want to change my clothes as well to something more expensive. And suddenly my 5-year-old car looks ugly parked outside of my brand new house. So I buy a new car and I start to make so many different purchases unrelated to the first purchase, in this scenario a house, just because of this Diderot effect, where one purchase leads to another after another after another. And of course, we can see this Diderot effect in smaller scales as well. Let's say that you purchase a new phone and suddenly you want to protect it, so you buy new cases. And maybe you switch from Android to iOS or vice versa, and now you need new subscription for cloud storage or something. And maybe you want a new smartwatch to go with your new phone, so the initial phone purchase branched into many different purchases. Of course, leaving you with even less money than before. The 4x square rule is again very useful to fight against this Diderot effect. We have to make sure that these are our priorities and that we can afford all of these purchases twice. And even if we fall prey to this Diderot effect and we make a lot of purchases by following the 4x square rule, it means that at the same time we also saved a lot of money. So for example, let's say that I spent $1,000 on a phone that escalated to $2,000 on many other different things because of the Diderot effect. If we follow the 4x square rule, that also means that I will have $2,000 more on my savings account. So win-win, I guess. But there you have it, these 5 different cognitive biases that are working constantly against us when it comes to saving our money, our personal finances in general, and a little bit about how you can start fighting against them. Mainly by implementing that 4x square rule, but also with many different techniques as well. I hope that this video has been useful. If it was, please consider sharing it with everyone so more people know about these biases, start to identify them, and start to fight against them so they can improve their personal finances as well. See you in the next one.